It's now my privilege to invite to the stage our respected panelists for our next session. Could we have Mr. Venkatesh Kini, President Coca-Cola India and Southwest Asia, join us? Welcome, sir. Ms. Roopa Purushothaman, Managing Director, Everstone Capital. Ms. Smriti Ranjan, student, Indian School of Business. Yes, we have two students joining us today. We also have Mr. Surya Adury, student, BMU. The youth of today joining us, well, of course, because it's a discussion about the youth. And finally, we have Ms. Suhasini Haider, editor, The Hindu, who will be taking the session forward. To tell you a little about the session, ladies and gentlemen, today Generation Y or Generation Youth is on fire. From social activism to entrepreneurship to uniting people on critical issues, it, or if I can say we, if I can count myself as a part of the youth, have suddenly emerged as a force to reckon with. Today we have young people leaving the comfort of their corporate jobs to pursue their own dreams and realizing them with cutting-edge innovation. They are also spearheading exceptionally successful startups. At the social level, they are involved and they're doing stirring campaigns that mobilize a previously apathetic public to spring into action and create change. To name a few examples, we have the Ugly India campaign, anti-rape protests, anti-corruption movements. The canvas is suddenly alive with their dynamism and intense involvement. So the question that we are asking here today, that does the youngest population of the world hold the winning trump cards? Our session 6, India in 2025, Can the Young Create a Baggage-Free Future, takes this up. And now it's over to you.
Thanks so much. And thanks so much for joining us in this post-tea time session. As you can probably see from the panel here, this is a unique panel. Unlike all the other panels you've seen, we don't have one minister here. We don't have one member of the government here. And the average age, courtesy everyone but me and Venkatesh, is about a few decades less than the other sessions you would find. Why is this panel on today? Well, the organizers felt that as we discuss India's future, and we are talking about 2025, it doesn't make sense to only have those on stage, and in that I include myself, people who perhaps are not going to be the driving force in 2025. As India gets younger and its population that is below 22 today, between 18 and 22 today represents more than 16% of the electorate, we are going to see that particular demographic playing a much, much bigger role. So how does that demographic really view where India is today? Is what we are seeing today as politics essentially going to change? Is the way the youth see their economic future in India going to change? How does this generation that has actually grown up with a computer, grown up with the internet, see their future as different? And I'm very glad that Venkatesh is joining me on this, because I think very few people have their finger on the pulse of what this demographic really thinks, as somebody like Venkatesh does, who is catering in a sense to bringing that new generation into the market to understand their needs and also, of course, their aspirations. So I'm going to just kick this session off. What I'm hoping is to get a lot of questions from all of you. So I'll start with a preliminary discussion here, but I do want to ask all of you to join in this discussion, because really it's an understanding of where we are headed that we're really looking for. To begin with, you know, there were so many surveys that were done last year, just before the election. What does India's youth want? What is the most important issue for them? And I think I looked at about 3 surveys that were done, 2 by international agencies, 1 by an Indian one. And essentially they brought up similar statistics. Something like 40% of the people they spoke to in that demographic said they worried about jobs. Another 20 worried about rising prices, inflation, and coping with that. And then the next, perhaps 15% spoke about, or more talked about corruption. Essentially, the bulk, practically 90%, 95% of the youth was worried about the economy. So I'm going to start with you, Roopa. Where do you see India today We've had a lot of talk all day over here about the targets that are being met, the targets that are being set. Give me a sense of where you see India as an economy, not just internally and the domestic situation, but in the world.
Sure, I think it's a crazy world we live in. When we talk about going back a year, when you look at India on the global stage, we were just so out of favor globally, beset by low productivity, inflation, as you mentioned, a volatile currency. And it's just amazing that now we are touted as being the bright spot, I think is what the IMF calls it, but really one of the only growth drivers globally. And I think a lot of people will say it comes down to the elections. My view is a little bit different. I think that, if you look at all of the cyclical data, and especially now when you look at the CapEx cycle and all of the indicators are showing that it's turned. I think we had sort of February, March of last year as the beginning, the green shoots of an upturn. And what happened is that the election really, sentiment pushed that forward. So, 2 months turned into, 6 to 9 months of good data, and it became something really solid. I would say just a couple of points on growth. I think the worry for India is that right now it's now or never. And we might have said that from 2006 onwards, but the sad thing is that we kind of had a lost decade. But when we look at, and I wouldn't even say it's now to 2025, but it really is the next 2.5 decades that will be just a fascinating place to live globally. You'll have India with this great, but perilous demographic divide or demographic boon, which we think that it will be. On the flip side, there's this sort of underappreciated story of how quickly China will age, and it's over the same exact time period. This 2.5 to 3 decades, you're going to have China aging at a pace that no country has ever seen before. And at the same time, it opens up this big sort of, opening for India to take charge. And by all means, it looks like we're starting to get there, but how quickly that happens is going to be really up to this generation. So I think this generation, probably the one just after me and teens, are really going to be the definitive generation for the country. But the big question is that we can talk about having a cyclical upturn. The bigger issue is that all of the developmental things that we need to think about, health and malnutrition, education, gender, all of these are not things that are fixed by growth. And growth is this, while overall it's wonderful for me to be a cheerleader and go out and talk to international investors about how great India is, but it can be a very dislocative and ugly process. And so I think really focusing on those things are going to be key for these 2 generations below me. Last point I'll make is that while everyone focuses on infrastructure, to me that's not the big issue. The big issue is going to be employment generation, and we need to be talking about that a lot more. We need to generate 10 million jobs a year to really satisfy these generations that are coming online. So that's going to be crucial.
All right, all very good points. Roopa's made. Venkatesh, I do want to ask you, she said, of course, jobs, most importantly, the fact that India is seen as this bright spot. But if you put those 2 together, that you have essentially a youth population that's burgeoning, is huge, and is possibly disillusioned because job growth is not keeping up with it, is that bright spot analogy going to last?
I think the solution to the challenge of job creation is going to come from the youth. Because if you think about the current generation of youth in India, it's actually grown up post the socialist era. And this is the first generation that's going to come of age without a shortage mindset. And the first generation that's coming of age that actually has seen personal initiative and not family inheritance being a source of growth and a source of success. So I actually feel that we don't even know what today's youth is capable of doing and what solutions they might find to some of the challenges that the economy faces today. And I know that everyone's staring at 10 million new people coming into the workforce and barely 1 million jobs being created. But the entrepreneurial drive and the initiative that I'm seeing in youth, not just in urban but even in rural India, gives me hope that we might actually find a uniquely Indian solution to this, as opposed to a manufacturing-driven, top-down solution that some other countries have found.
But the fact is, all of those sound good, and to put it on the youth to really produce these jobs is very important. But are we really able to skill the youth as towards the jobs that are going to be available for them? It always seems to be. I mean, we have two young MBAs over here, so I don't want to. I don't want to sound negative, but at the end of the day, we're producing this entire generation that's, educating itself in one skill, while India has huge gaps in others.
Actually, just yesterday I was at an event where the skill development minister spoke, and I think he said something very interesting. It takes 10 years to educate a child, but it takes 10 weeks to skill an adult. So we've got a foundation that does work with illiterate women in rural India, and all they take is about 2 or 3 weeks of training to learn how to make solar lanterns. And then with that skill, they're able to go out and start selling solar lanterns to surrounding villages and create livelihood for themselves. So I think skill building might actually be the solution where education has failed us, but much quicker, targeted, very precise skill building, and that too bottom-up, demand-driven, might solve a challenge.
All right, Smriti, I do want to ask, and I'm being the tough person over here, because I'm looking at a young generation that we have so much expectation from. They know how to organize themselves. In the last few years, the kind of mass rallies we've seen, the youth come out, we had our own little version of what is now called the Arab Revolution, but was called the Arab Spring. We had young people organizing themselves on Facebook, coming out there, putting the message out. We had young people who were a part of the last election, coming out in very large numbers for the party that won with such a huge mandate, organizing themselves electronically on the streets and all the rest. And then we found that, they didn't vote particularly more than any other demographic. Then we found that when they did come into positions of power, they didn't do anything particularly different. And finally, we found that the ones who did, make it through tend to be, unlike what Venkatesh said, just children of well-placed individuals. India more and more, 33% of the leadership is already from families of leadership. My question really is this a youth that is going to actually take their own destiny in their hands, or are they really just good at the hype?
I would say they would take their own destiny in their hand. And to answer that question, I'll probably point you to the private sector, which has a plethora of success stories of startups, which are probably answering some urgent requirements of society which were not met by the government. It somehow kind of unravels itself when people go into the government. So I think the answering that really has to be done is, how can you probably combine the energy and the enthusiasm and the boundless innovation that the youth can bring in with existing structures? I think the speaker who introduced us mentioned movements such as Ugly Indian or the rape movements. My only issue with them are they're very sporadic in nature. Now, I think they're sporadic in nature just for the simple reason that they are very instantaneous reaction to some problems in society. Now, if you really want a continuous, more rigorous solution, this has to be combined with some government initiatives. And I think it works both ways. So there is one section of the society where the youth is, of course, doing really well and kind of figuring out problems and solving them on its own. But I think it also puts some onus on the government as to how can they actually harness this more, probably getting more people into IAS or increasing the intake there. United Nations runs a very specific targeted campaigns in Africa, which I think is called UNFCP, if I get that name right, where they actually take people from the local community and start training them in leadership roles right from the beginning. So the youth are encouraged to figure out the problem and then figure out solutions. So I think if something of that kind is also brought into Indian political structure, rather than just taking up youth and placing them in existing institutions. So I think
what you're saying is not there on the agendas of any of our current political parties. Yeah. Do you think India is ready for a new kind of politics in 10 years?
Yes, I think so. I think it'll be more a demand of society rather than probably, it'll be more demand oriented rather than it being more proactive, but I think that is how it'll be.
That's an interesting point, Surya, you were making earlier, that even if the government of the day is not hitting all the targets they wanted to, maybe compared to the past, politicians in general are having to become much more receptive to any kind of complaint. Do you think that's a factor of this new generation?
I think if you look at any issue currently, in any burning issue, for example, net neutrality, you had AIB coming up with a video, and then you have 10 lakh people mailing them. I'd not go into whether I think that's a very bad issue to kind of support. I'm not for net neutrality for different reasons. But then there's activism. I mean, I think that they've earlier, I think even if they wanted to go ahead and communicate to the government, they did not have any platform. But thanks to social media and thanks to many other platforms today, politicians are in a way forced to kind of, listen to people. I think that's I think is, an incredible thing that has happened in the recent past.
All right. And as a member of this young generation, and let me tell you that Surya is going to be a member of this young generation in 2025 as well. The youngest panelist, I'm sure, during this session. Where do you see India's position in the world? I mean, the fact is we talk about, the Prime Minister has made, or by the end of next month, he will have made 18 visits abroad, or to 18 countries abroad in 12 months. India has this new place, as Roopa was saying, in the world. But does foreign policy really matter?
I think foreign policy I think more than anything else, when you talk about those 18 visits, I think the greater point here is that we're not self-confident. Whenever he makes a visit outside, you would see an article in your Indian newspapers that the French newspaper, they've given a center spread to Mr. Modi. New York Times has spoken about Mr. Modi this way and all of that. It's never about, it's rarely about what's happening out there, but then it's about what they perceive about us. I think that's a little sad. I think it's important for the media to go out there and probably take pride in whatever we do. I think it's important. I think that's a greater point that
I think that's a very perceptive statement, and I hope that the questions that we get now are going to get a few more of these reactions out. Venkatesh, I do want to ask you to put in a reality check, if you like. Roopa spoke about the fact that China is growing old faster than it'll grow rich, and there is this sense in India. In the last week, we've seen headlines being created by the idea that India is going to outstrip China in growth. Obviously, it's just in the rate of growth, but there is this perception that it is an India versus China world in the future, in 10 years. Give me your thoughts.
I think that's oversimplifying the global economic context. China is in a very different stage, and it's a very, very different economic model from India. So comparisons are really, it's apples and oranges. The second thing is that, if you look at the competition for global capital, it's not just going to come from China. Today, Philippines is surging. Sub-Saharan Africa is amongst the fastest growing regions of the world. So we don't know where in 2020 or 2025, which new country is going to come up to compete for talent, for capital, for investment. And ultimately population or the demographic dividend is not good enough to attract capital to India. So we cannot be complacent about the fact that we are outstripping China's growth for a year or two or three, or that today we are the best performing of the BRICS countries, we're the tallest midget. That doesn't help. What matters is, are we creating enough growth and enough jobs in the country to absorb the workforce that's coming out and to meet the aspirations and raise the living standards of a billion people? And as a result of that, if we outstrip China, great. If not, it doesn't matter.
All right. I'm going to go around our panelists before I come to the questions with a simple question. And I'll start with you, Venkatesh, to give the others a chance to think about this. When you talk about where India needs to be in 2025, and on one side, it helps to have the hype. It helps to have the dreams. It helps to have the aspirations of an entire country heading in one direction, because hopefully we lead some part of the way. What Piyush Goyal was saying, that if I didn't keep my target really high, we wouldn't even reach half of it. The question I would like to ask all our panelists is, what are the three things you think India really needs to focus on to get there?
Wow. I'd say One is physical infrastructure. That's been repeatedly talked about, physical infrastructure. The second is investment in human capital. I talked about skill building, but human capital goes beyond skill building. It's also health. And I think the Swachh Bharat and Swasth Bharat is a great step forward. But investment in building skills and health of people in human capital is second. And the third is freedom of resource movement. And I'm saying resource movement as in the freedom of goods, of talent, of ideas to move across borders within the country and outside. Those three things I think are very important.
All right, simple but sophisticated. Roopa, do you have thoughts on that?
Just so I'm not repeating, I'll just add two new ones. I think one is obviously governance in the sense of, when so many young people are starting new businesses, having clarity on how to do these things will quicken the time. So I think that's a big thing. Second big thing, I think 10 years actually is not a long time. And one of the quickest things that we can do is get a lot of our talented women in the workforce.
Okay, that's important. Do you want to go first?
Investment in primary and secondary education, ease of doing business, and getting rural India on the internet roadmap.
Very important, all three.
So when we talk about creating 10 million jobs a year, I think that's not creating jobs is the end of the day, you'll have to encourage entrepreneurship. So you'll need to create those ecosystems everywhere. As I think Mr. Chandrababu Naidu is doing it in Vizag and Vijayawada. We'll need that to happen at a lot of other places, making sure that capital is easy to kind of access, and there's universities who kind of pursue curriculums that are relevant to the industry and all of that. So I think we need to create a lot of these entrepreneurial ecosystems in order for us to be able to create those 10 million jobs every year.
I think that does tie up with what we were talking about, because in Australia, for example, they actually have a commission that just deals with this. They find out what are the jobs likely to be in the next 5 years, so that they tell students going into college, you can study whatever you want, but here's where the opportunities are, as opposed to a system where you essentially tell people these are the most prestigious jobs to get into, and so everybody tries for the same jobs, the most well-paying jobs and all the rest of that. So perhaps that kind of intelligence skilling is important. He brought up, actually Smriti brought up the question of educating the youngest and educating girls in particular. Now Roopa actually is part of that young generation doing that little bit extra and is working on a girls' school outside Delhi, is it? Or outside Pune. And before I get to your questions, I do want to ask her to read out what one of the young students at a municipal school wrote when she was asked, what would you like to have done by the time you are 50? Go ahead.
Okay, so this was written by a 6th grade girl in a Pune municipal school in really good handwriting. I would have studied all about how to teach kids, all about the environment, and all countries. I would have done many MUNs, model UNs, and also would have chaired a lot of committees. I would be a teacher in a village teaching kids. I would have played football on a state level and international level for my state and country. I would want my brother and sister to get the best education. I want my mother and father to have their own house on their name, a place where my mother and father can help people in learning tailoring and driving. I would want to open an organization which helps the government take the right decision for the country. I would want that all the children get educated in India and have a bright future. Since I moved to India 10 years ago, I've been working with adolescent girls. And when we did this exercise 10 years ago, we would get blank sheets of paper back. In the last 10 years, the kind of confidence that these girls have is really striking.
And interestingly, that we discussed each of those aspirations in the last 15 to 20 minutes, except perhaps that one of a roof over your head with a home in your own name. I think this is really the symbol of an aspirational India, which actually sees a roadmap to where it wants to get. Questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
So when I was hearing the panel, two things were coming to my mind again and again. So we always talk about India as a whole, but India, we can't talk as a whole because it's a clusters. And like when we are talking about employment, like employments for different people has to be thought differently. So don't you think we have to think on these terms, like the segments we are, like how we can think of these segments. Second is, I think sustainability is a very big factor. We sometimes talk too much about one thing and then I think like it just passes by. So what should we be doing things so that it sustains over a long period and we keep continuing on the things we start with?
All right, Smriti, you want to take that?
So I think I brought it out earlier when I was talking about how can we actually create solutions which last for a very long time rather than just being sporadic movements. So there is no other way to go but integrating it with existing structures. I mean, you can have standalone protests, but unless you make that into a more meaningful, more widespread solution, you'll end up only catering to probably one city or probably two cities at max. It'll never really reach the rural population at all. So it's very important that both the private sector, which is taking the initiative, and the government, which has an interest in actually making that solution more readily available, come together and kind of culminate it into a solution which can actually be packaged and repackaged so that it reaches all over India. Coming to your first question about employment for different clusters, yes, every segment has a different need and a different different kind of criteria that they want to look at. But I think somewhere the answer also lies in us shifting from being just a job seeker to being a job creator. And that is a point that I also wanted to bring out earlier. I think what Sir mentioned earlier was also the fact that this is probably one segment of the Indian population which has come into being with the confidence that they can actually create another enterprise on their own. And I think giving that confidence across the different segment of society, whether you probably have someone who is selling vegetables and starts his own micro-enterprise of probably collating all the vegetable vendors together and starting an enterprise there, or probably someone right at the top, say a delivery, which is catering to e-commerce. So I think if you kind of infuse that entrepreneurial spirit all throughout, I think that can possibly be one solution you can look at.
Okay, nice. Questions? Go ahead, sir.
I'm not going to make questions. I want to make a very brief comment.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm delighted to see 3 women on the stage and 2 men. All
I forgot to mention that that also made this panel different.
All the previous sessions, there's been either no woman or just the odd woman. And I see the future of India in this. Thank you very much for being on the stage. All young.
Well, thank you, Mr. Munjal, for putting it together. Go ahead, sir.
Pardon me for this question. I don't want to sound like a cynic, but I just have a thought from these youngsters. I come from a medical profession, and Dr. Trehan is here. He would second this. Every profession demands that you go through a process of learning, through a process of grinding, and then you reach the level where Venkatesh is today or where Suhasini is today. Probably it appears to me, and I have 2 young daughters, the youth of today is wants results very fast, is very expressive, and wants to be at the COO level right away. So what is the take of the learned experts here, and how do the youth feel I somehow have a feeling that you still need to go through a process before you have enough exposure, and the exposure should start from the rock bottom rather than.
All right, I'm going to try and take that question because, you know, I used to work in television for years, and when young people used to come to meet me, I'd ask them the first question, which is, you know, so what do you want to do? And they'd always reply and say, ma'am, I want to read the news. And I'd say, yes, you must read the newspapers, you must watch all the channels, read online, try and get foreign papers as well, and must read a lot, it's very good for you. And then I'd realized I'd lost them somewhere because they were actually saying, I'd like your job. Can I please just get on TV now? And how long is it going to take for you to get out of here? So I do share that sentiment somehow, but I do also want to make the point that the game has changed. Years ago, I used to try to tell people that, you know, it takes 6 years of learning how to do this, learn every part of the business, even just practicing carrying a heavy tripod or a heavy camera, you know, you must get used to all of this. And the game changed so quickly. Everyone has a little iPhone and they're doing as good a job or even better in some cases than our generation did. So I do want to make the point that so much has changed that also the game changes. It's not just that the youth is impatient to get into it, but the youth has a new aspiration and a new place to go. They don't want to reach where you have very politely said I have reached. They want to reach something much, much more different and in fact much higher. Venkatesh, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do want to point out that I think we've reached a stage where ability and attitude trump age. And we are seeing increasingly with youth of today that in their 30s, they're heading companies. and companies, corporates that want to employ today's youth have to recognize that if you don't give them those opportunities, because they have the ability and they have the attitude, they're going to go out and create their own companies and become entrepreneurs. So I would probably slightly differ. The other thing, as Suhasini mentioned, is that the learning curve is much faster today. Today's youth know more by the time they're 18 than we, our older generation took 80 years to learn. They learn by the time they're 18. The internet and exposure to digital technology, and I think brains are getting rewired in a different way. So who knows what they're able to achieve tomorrow?
I'd like to hear from you. Go ahead.
I'm not sure. I guess the point that I wanted to make was your second point. I mean, if you look at Hero, for example, I think it took I think 5-6 decades to probably reach a certain valuation. Now we have a Facebook in United States which is probably 4-5 years old, and then you look at its valuation. So I think that is a greater point. I mean, times have changed. So I think I'm not sure if I'm the right person to kind of answer this, but then that's the shift.
So you're representing the new impatient, not completely ready generation. But thank you for that. Do you have something to add?
I think for me it's just about making my own decisions, failing on my own, and then just getting up and going for what I want. So I take a slightly philosophical view to this, and it's that I want to be the master of my own destiny. And if I think I can possibly run a company right now, I will make mistakes and then learn and move on. So that's the only view I take. As
Venkatesh put it, the attitude is very different, and it doesn't matter. I have time for one last question. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. And I'll join Justice Leela Seth in complimenting the panel. And I think it has a lot of meaning when it is told by the first Chief Justice of an Indian High Court. So it's a great thing that has come. Now, I have a very naive question, and it is for you to answer or ignore it. The topic was that to build up a baggage-free future. And I asked the youth the question whether there is any space for this baggage-free future, in this baggage-free future, for the moral values, for the values with which we lived, our generation lived, whether you'll debunk all of that and you'll carry a little bit of it, which is also very good in our society, especially respecting your parents, listening to them, and caring for them in the old age. I just leave it as a question. You may answer or you may ignore it. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So there's just a story when you were just recounting it, and I just remembered. So I remember reading this interview of Indra Nooyi, and she said that after she'd become president of Pepsi, she came back home, and her mother asked her to get milk. And she was really surprised because she was like, why can't my husband get milk? And then, of course, her mom went on to say, you might be president of Pepsi elsewhere, but in this house, you're probably a mom and a wife first. So I think that is the kind of view that I would probably take to this. And probably when I enter my house, I recently completed my graduation, and my mom just went about every other thing just normally. We did not even mention graduation, and I just went about my normal household chores like it always done. So I think this generation kind of recognizes the best of both, and they kind of merge it very easily, the best of both, as you've said. And I think respect for parents probably comes foremost to everything else. And I think there are lessons that we learn from your generation. My dad works in a private sector, in a PSU, and the lessons that I learned from him, the hardworking and the perseverance, etc. But there are also things that I want to avoid that he possibly went through. So I think it's a combination of the best of both.
I think your answer that you're getting is that we'll just ignore what we don't like. But when it comes to baggage, you know what was important in one of the studies I did read in The Economist, which did a very detailed study on attitudes of the youth. And one of the questions they asked is how much do old stratifications in society, caste and religion, matter to you when you go out to vote? And that demographic was completely different from the rest of the country, because this demographic between 18 to 22, 77% said it doesn't matter at all. So we are seeing some of the baggage that perhaps we do want to dump, getting dumped in this generation, and hopefully some of the good stuff staying on. And I'm going to go for one last question to Mr. Qureshi, because he presided over a lot of the elections where we saw the youth come back. Can we get a mic to him, please?
Thank you, Suhasini. More than the Election Commission, actually I have worked in youth affairs for a long time. I was Joint Secretary Youth Affairs, Secretary Youth Affairs, Director General of Nehru Yuva Kendra Sangathan, and I understand a little bit of youth. Unfortunately, what was discussed in this session missed out 90% of the youth who we should be talking about. They are rural, semi-urban, illiterate, unemployable, directionless. Those are the guys who join the Marxists because they need work. Whosoever gives them work, they join them. They are the guys who are on the forefront of all riots because they have nothing to do. So, but I saw the ray of hope in what Venkatesh said, that it may take 10 years to educate, but it may take 3 weeks to give them vocational training. I have been in the civil service 40 years, and I have seen for even a minister, prime minister, chief minister, when he goes back to his constituency, all that they ask him is job. Foreign policy, this policy, that policy, they don't get job. We have a former chief minister in jail because of a job scam. We have another serving chief minister in deep trouble, job scam. One MP who landed in jail had the dubious the distinction of being the first person to be disqualified, got it because of this. I think we should not behave like ostriches. We should deal with this problem head on, and a serious discussion is required.
I agree with you. I just don't agree that we didn't touch the subject of the 90%, because I think the aspirations are similar across the country. Jobs is definitely right up on the agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for, but thanks for being such a great audience, and I'd like to get a round of applause for the panel here today. Thank you. You've all been
Thank you so much for that very youthful and insightful session. And now, in fact, I'd like to request Mr. Qureshi himself to please join us on stage, do the honors of presenting mementos to all our panelists. Welcome, sir. We will present Mr. Venkatesh Kini with a memento. Ms. Roopa Purushothaman. Of course, Ms. Suhasini Haider, editor of The Hindu, who's done a brilliant job steering the session. And of course, representing our youth here today, we have Ms. Smriti Ranjan and Mr. Surya Adury. Truly a wonderful session. Is that the youth lobby? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all.